This is Biology 2, Chapter 4 on Population Ecology. In this video lecture, we will be discussing population dynamics, taking a look at some different characteristics of populations, and what types of things makes populations rise or decline. When we study populations, remember a population is a group of organisms of the same species that generally hang out in the same area all the time. So when we study populations, we can look at a few different characteristics. Density being one of those. Population density is the number of organisms in a particular area. So if there are many members in a small area, that would mean that the population has a rather high density. If there are relatively few members in a large area, that would mean that the density is fairly low. When studying populations in an area, you can take a look at how the members of those populations are dispersed among the habitat. So dispersion is the pattern of spacing population in an area. And there are three general types of dispersion patterns. We have a uniform dispersion, which would be the example there with the penguins. Uniform dispersion is where every organism would have its own kind of personal bubble of space. Clumped dispersion would be like the school of fish example. There are groups that number few to many, but within the population, there are kind of pockets or clumps of density. And then a random dispersion pattern is very common in the plant community, as you see from our diagram. Seeds are dropped where they are dropped, either the wind or the water or animals transport those seeds and they stay where they lay and the plants grow from there. So a random dispersion has no particular pattern. We can also take a look at the distribution of organisms in an ecosystem. This is exactly where they are within that ecosystem. So in our two pictures there, we have some deer in a forest. Many forest areas have a small open area with mostly grass called a meadow, which is where the majority of deer would feed. So if there was a large forest, the distribution of the white-tailed deer would be mostly near the meadow. So that would be a biotic factor as a factor that can limit the distribution. The deer will go where the food is, and if the food is in the open meadow, that's where they'll be. Abiotic factors can also influence where organisms hang out within their ecosystem. Populations cannot get inordinately huge. There are limiting factors. And limiting factors will limit the numbers in the population. And the big four limiting factors in ecology are food, space, shelter, and mates. All organisms compete for these four resources. So with our wolves here as an example, wolves hunt, they are carnivores, they hunt in packs generally. But if there is enough food in the forest where they live, then not all of the members of their population may survive. Same thing with space. The territory in which a wolf pack runs in, if the space is limited, every wolf member needs kind of their own space. So if space is limited, numbers will be limited. Shelter as well. Foxes, or coyotes rather, live in dens, and again, the shelter, the amount of den space can also limit the members that are in the pack, and the number of mates can also limit numbers. If there is a rather small female to male ratio, then in some cases, the less mating there is going on, the less members of the next generation will appear. So the big four limiting factors are food, space, shelter, and mates. Different types of limiting factors. We can have density independent factors. Independent means that these factors, it's not going to depend on the number of members in the population. Abiotic factors are generally density independent. It's not going to matter if, for our wolf pack, if there's 10 wolves in the wolf pack or 100. If it rains, if it snows, if there's a drought, if there's severe weather, that's going to affect the population whether there's 10 or 1,000 wolves. Density-dependent factors, on the other hand, will depend on the number of members in the population. These are mostly biotic factors. Food sources for predators can be a density-dependent factor. If there is no food, then those animals will disperse somewhere else. Competition is another type of density-dependent factor. The more members there are in a population, the more competition there will be for the big four resources. Disease is also another type of density-dependent factor. If a disease comes through, the more members there are, the more likely those members are to get sick, and the population can be affected in that way. So how does a population grow? We can take a look at the growth rate of a population, how fast this occurs. In populations, we can enter a population through natality or being birthed into the population. And likewise, organisms can leave the population permanently by a fatality or a death. Another way that we can get organisms in and out is through immigration, which is where individuals enter the population. So immigration can be considered new organisms moving in or new births. Immigration and natality will raise the population numbers and the growth rate. Emigration, this is where individuals leave the population or they die. So we can consider immigration raising the population. Emigration lowers the numbers of the population. When we take a look at how to model this growth rate, very rapid increases in growth we call exponential growth models. This is a very geometric type of growth. If you were to graph it, it would resemble the capital letter J. So you start out with very few members, and then it skyrockets upward to several members in a very short time. A more realistic model of how many populations grow is called the logistic growth model. So this is when growth slows down, or maybe even for some periods of time actually stops. If we were to graph this, it would look more like a capital S, where you have a slight increase and then you kind of have a plateauing or an evening or a leveling out of the members in a population. Another way that populations can be limited is by the environment itself. The carrying capacity is the maximum number of individuals that the environment can actually support. So resources, whether they be abiotic resources, things like precipitation, or biotic resources, things like food, will limit the carrying capacity. And that's often abbreviated with a capital K. So if you look here on the diagrams I have on the screen, if you think of, the population like the limits, like a barrel, and you keep adding members, adding members, adding members, that barrel is only going to hold so much water before we're going to have some seepage, okay? So the carrying capacity is like the barrel itself. A forest ecosystem can only support so many members. For short periods of time, the population may go over the carrying capacity if there are seasons or years of bountiful or plentiful resources. In that case, there may be a brief period of time where the population goes over what the environment can support normally. But once the environment corrects itself again, then the population will also be limited as well. So the carrying capacity is the maximum number of populations that an environment can support. There's different ways that animals reproduce themselves because of the type of environment that they live in. Reproductive patterns in animals and our strategists. These critters live in an environment where the factors fluctuate. They never know if it's going to be good or if it's going to be bad. So these organisms, in order to survive as a species for the long haul, they make a lot of offspring in a very short time. And generally, they live fairly short lifespans. That way, the species is ensured survival over the long haul. So they have, usually these organisms have many more offspring in some cases than they can actually raise, or that actually will survive, to make sure that at least a couple make it on to the next generation. A K strategist, however, is an organism that lives in a very stable environment where the factors are plentiful or at least available at a steady rate. So because they don't have to worry about their environment and surviving through that, these organisms tend to have fewer offspring and they spend time raising them. And they tend to live very long lifespans because, again, if the factors are plentiful, then they don't have to worry about where is the next meal coming from or how are my offspring going to survive to the next season. So there's a difference kind of between how animals live in their environment and how they reproduce to live in those environments. This has been Biology 2, Chapter 4 on population ecology.